6-month countdown, ready to homeschool. We are on episode 11. You can download this. There's actually 7 pages this week. It's on my blog, hilarioushomeschooling.com. So I would highly recommend that you at least have it pulled up on your screen so you can follow along, because there's going to be quite a few things that I point out and discuss, and you might want to have a chance to read it. We are talking about reading, phonics, and literature. It's going to be a long episode. I will try to take a break about 15 minutes in, so that if you have something else you need to get done, because most of my videos have been about 15 minutes or less, and this one's going to be about double that. So I'll just try to tell you when is a good time to take a break. Everything that I have to say today is probably mostly about reading English. If you are homeschooling your child in a different language, some of this will transfer over, but some of it will not. So I just want to make sure I make that clear now. I have tried to learn Spanish and a little bit of French and some Swedish, and I'm realizing that once you learn the alphabet in one language, it doesn't always make the same sounds in a different language. And there's a whole bunch of other phonics rules that you have to learn for each language that you're learning. So as I talk about reading, phonics, and literature today, I am discussing English because that's the language that I'm most familiar with. We tend to value literacy very highly in America. That was not always the case in every other civilization. Some civilizations only had a few people who would be the scribes, the people who would read and write. Some people were especially educated in their society just to be the ones to do the official business and keep the official documents and read and write on an everyday basis. A lot of times in a society, a vast majority of people didn't need to read. And so some of them just never learned how. And that was just not something that they ever acquired. In America, we tend to have this idea that everybody should be literate. And so we put a lot of time and energy into that in our public schools. And this actually probably came about, if you think about it, one of the first societies that was in America, in the settlers, the people who came over from Europe, they would have wanted their children to learn to read the Bible. And so they promoted literacy in their culture. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that we have such a high value on literacy in America today, is it goes back to that root. I wanted to point out that that is actually true in the Bible as well. Acts 17:11 says, "Now the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true." And that's actually one of the reasons that Americans value literacy, is because when you have a person who is literate, they can check documents and they can read the law for themselves. And in some societies, they actually wanted to try to keep people illiterate so that they wouldn't be able to find out what their rights were. So one of the purposes for learning to read is to be able to know what your rights are, know what the law says, know what the Word of God says, and be able to know what truth is. And so sometimes students don't understand that that's the point. And even us as parents, sometimes we forget that that's the point, that we're training our kids to value freedom and righteousness. And so we want them to be able to read for themselves. It's a skill that we think is worth passing on to the next generation. And so we put a lot of time and energy into it. I think sometimes they push that too quickly in the public schools. I don't think all kids are ready to read at age 5. Some are. Some are ready to read at age 3. But some students don't mature until around 7 or 8. And they are, in the public schools, it is often not intentionally, but they notice that they are behind the other kids. So if you are dealing with a kid who is struggling with reading and isn't ready to read, it is okay to delay reading instruction for a year or 2, sometimes 3, to give their brain a chance to catch up. That's not the philosophy in the public school. In the public school, they want early intervention so that a student doesn't get far behind in their reading abilities. So that is where you might see a different tension between homeschool families and public school families. So we said that literacy is highly valued in our culture. The problem is that reading is not a natural ability. Learning a language, learning to speak and listen to a language is a natural ability. It seems like back in the 70s, there was a theorist, a psychological theorist, who came up with the idea of a language acquisition device. I put that in your notes in case you want to research it. That the idea that if you put a baby in any culture, they'll be able to acquire the language that they hear every day naturally. It's not something they have to study. They're able to grasp the sounds, the syntax, the grammar, all of those things. They learn in a pattern, and kind of, there's certain ways, like an order in which they learn it, and usually very fluently by the age of 4 to 6. If you're not raised in that certain culture, you actually lose the ability to make some of those sounds naturally, which is one reason that there are proponents of foreign language study that say have kids learn a second language by the time they're 21, if you want them to not have an accent. Sorry, that's a rabbit trail. Okay. I've made a little chart there for you so that you could see the different types of language, the way we use language and the way that we learn language. There's oral and aural. That's what we speak and what we hear. There's written code. That's like using the letters of an alphabet to put down sounds. There's receptive. That's when you take it in. And there's expressive. That's when you spit it back out. So there we see our 4 ways that we use language. Listening is receptive, taking something in through the ears. Speaking is expressing, putting something out through the mouth. The written code, then, receptive would be reading, taking it in with the letters. And writing would be putting it back out, learning to write the code yourself. So in general, babies and kids learn the receptive skills earlier than they learn the expressive skills. Babies often are able to understand what you say even before they're able to say the same word back. Or they're able to understand complete sentences before they're able to speak a complete sentence. And the same pattern holds true with young elementary students. Often they will learn to read before they are able to write it. So they can actually read an entire page of text. But if you ask them to write a page-long story, their skills aren't there yet. They might not have the handwriting ability or the spelling ability or know how to put in periods or question marks. So we have to remember that there's usually a lag between the receptive skills and the expressive skills. And remember to give them time to mature and gain that. Reading involves written codes, and the written code represents words. There are a few languages that would be called pictorial, where the marking that you see would actually be a picture or a little character that stands for a picture. Some of the Oriental languages like Chinese or Japanese have some elements of that. For English and Spanish and the Latin languages, there is a phonetic code, whereas a letter stands for a sound. That means that we're able to put we can just have 26 letters and then we can write the entire language with those 26 letters. So alphabets, phonetics, give us a bigger power to be able to write more words with less characters. If you had a pictorial language, you have to have a character for almost every concept that you want to convey, and then it actually is a lot of things to memorize. All right. At the public school that I worked at last year, they were very into this thing called science of reading. If you want to find more about this, you can look up YouTube videos that you just type in science of reading and you'll get a whole bunch of stuff. They have been doing neurological studies on people's brains, trying to figure out which part of the brain is active in learning to read and how do we store that information in our brains. They want to do this so that they can help more kids learn to read and learn to read early on. There's a strategy that they call phonemic or phonological awareness that they think is helping kids more than just all the different things that we always thought kids learn to read with. Phonemic awareness is this idea of being able to take sounds and break them apart. And I've put in your notes, I've put some information about that. This comes from a book called Equipped for Reading Success that I read last year. This guy has done a lot of research in helping to figure out how parents can help their kids learn to read and how teachers can help their kids learn to read. And he says that there's different skills that get harder and harder, and the kids need to acquire all of these skills in order to be able to read, because reading is just taking parts like cat and bat. They rhyme because they have the same ending sounds, but they don't have the same beginning sound. So helping a kid understand that we've taken the k off of at and we add a b instead of the k, we're going to make a whole new word. So practice with that kind of thing. And it's not even necessarily looking at letters. It's practicing hearing the sounds and breaking apart the sounds. This is one reason why nursery rhymes are so great for preschoolers, is because they're playing with language without even having to see anything written down. Some examples of the exercises that he would have in this book, Equipped for Reading Success, that he says are very helpful in helping kids learn to read, would be things like, say the word flip. Now say flip, but don't say f. And the child's supposed to say lip. Or maybe he would say cart. Now say cart, but don't say t. And they would have to take the T off of the end. Again, they're not looking at anything. They're not manipulating letters or tiles. They could use tiles, but oftentimes this is just done back and forth talking with a student. And they're doing this in their mind. So if you take off the t, you have car. When you get to blends, it gets even harder. Say the word free. Free. Now change the to ul. And then you would have the word flee. That's a more difficult concept than something like, say the word man. Now say man, but don't say an. And you just have the sound that's left. So these are all things that you can do. Even, as you're washing dishes and your kid is right next to you, or, you're on a car ride, these are word games that you can play with kids to help them prepare to be able to read later. And all of this falls under the category of phonemic awareness. So if that's something that interests you, do some more research on that and think about how you can incorporate that into your everyday life with preschoolers, because it will help. The other thing that I saw when I was teaching in the public school is this thing that's called Scarborough's rope. And it comes from a person whose last name is Scarborough. And they came up with this visual to help us understand how complicated reading is. Way over here on this side, we have skilled reading, which is what we think of as adults, where, you can pick up a piece of paper and read the whole thing out loud to anybody and not stumble on words and all that kind of stuff. But look at all the different strands that have to go into skilled reading over here. These are all the things that we're expecting kids to be able to understand as they begin the reading process, so that they can put it all together later and be a skilled reader. Not many 4-year-olds are skilled readers yet, because they're still working on all of these things. So here we have basic comprehension, and here we have what we would call the phonics. Phonological awareness is right here. That's what we were just talking about. Decoding is being able to see letters on a page and put it together into a word that they've heard before. And sight recognition is something like sight words, familiar words that don't follow the pattern. So like the word said. Said has an A and an I in the middle of it. So we should pronounce it said, but we don't, because it's English. Or the word to. To has an O at the end of it without anything else. So it should be toe, but we don't say it like that. We say to. So there's a lot of sight words that kids have to learn as they're learning phonics and as they're getting more and more skilled at taking words apart and putting them back together. All of that goes into word recognition skills. But up at the top, there's all these other key things that are comprehension. Comprehension usually develops naturally with kids who are encouraged to talk and listen, have conversations, are exposed to many things in their world. Background knowledge is actually an important skill in reading, where, you know, if they are going to read a book someday about the zoo, but they've never been to a zoo themselves, it's very hard for them to connect all of the ideas because they don't have firsthand knowledge of a zoo. So background knowledge is just the idea that your kids are exposed to lots of different things, which will come into play later in their life when they're asked to read about something. They'll be bringing that knowledge back to the job at hand because they have been to something like that. Vocabulary, the English language has tons of words, and we don't use all of them all the time. Our speaking vocabulary is much smaller than the dictionary. So vocabulary is just continuing to add new words, not just to their reading, but to their overall comprehension of their own language. Language structures, that would be like how we put words together and how they fit together, and why we don't say things like he goes, I'm getting the wrong one. He go to the party. He go to the party. We need to change it to went. Or he and she buys their favorite candy. It has to be by because it's he and she, two people. So that's just what they're talking about with language structures. Verbal reasoning. This is being able to read between the lines. Like maybe they don't come right out and say that it was raining in the story, but the kid gets wet, walking from his house to the park. So then you're just asking the kid to fill in the blanks. Why did the kid get wet walking from his house to the park? Well, it must have been because it's raining. So that's just being able to read between the lines and find out what an author is really getting at. And literary knowledge, the idea of genre, that, sometimes stories are telling a true story about the author's life, and sometimes the author has made up a story, and that would be fiction, or maybe it's a poem. They're just becoming more familiar with the literary forms that are out there. So all of this in Scarborough's Rope can help you understand how complicated the job of reading is for anybody. It's a wonder that any of us learn to read. But surprisingly, a lot of kids pick it up no matter what curriculum you use. I think the number's about 85%, I read somewhere, that no matter what curriculum you decide to use, about 85% of the kids will learn using that curriculum. When you have the other 15% that haven't been able to learn, no matter what curriculum you're using, that's where we get frustrated. And the kids get frustrated because they're really, really trying. And they know that they're not doing what you want them to do and what society expects them to do. And then they have, this self-concept that gets worse and worse and worse. So we want to try to take the pressure off of kids, that they can learn to read. We will help them learn to read. It might take them longer. It might take more practice. It might be an uphill climb, but just assuring them that everybody's got a challenge in life, and we'll help you get through this one too. And sometimes that's hard to do when you're the mom and the teacher, because it can get frustrating day after day after day to have somebody who you think maybe could try a little harder, but then as soon as you say that, you made them feel awful about themselves. It's a fine line to walk, and there's lots of tears on both the kid and the parents' side. I don't want to discourage you. I'm just being honest that sometimes when a child can't learn to read with the curriculum that you thought was perfect, there's some frustration there. So, all right. I've got a lot of reading resources to share with you, but before we get to that, I want to go ahead and go through the rest of this sheet real quick and just talk about what the goals are at each stage. And then I've got some resources to show you. So, the preschool years, it is best to just focus on word games, picture books, that experience base we were talking about that will increase comprehension later in life, the wide exposure to the world. Learning the alphabet song is very helpful, and starting to recognize the alphabet without pressure, just learning to know that, these are the letters, and you can play with letters. Magnetic letters are always fun, just pointing out things like that. And drawing, just learning to control their hand motions and make their own, whether they're letters or not letters, it's fine, but just learning to make their own figures on paper. So that's the preschool years. In the elementary years, that's when you want to start with phonics. If you have a preschooler who really wants to learn phonics, then go for it. But I wouldn't say to push it unless they're really wanting to. The early elementary years is a good time to do phonics and the sight words that we talked about already. I put on there that there's these Dolch lists. Dolch is somebody in our reading education background who came up with a bunch of lists, starting out with the easier sight words and then going to harder sight words. So if you Google Dolch lists, you can find all sorts of different sight words to practice. Comprehension. That's what we were talking about before with Scarborough's rope. Do they understand what they're reading? Do they understand what you're reading when you read out loud? What parts of the story are hard for them to comprehend and what parts are easy? And just practicing comprehension with them without them knowing it. You don't have to do comprehension worksheets. You can just enjoy a story together and then talk about it. And again, wide exposure to different genres of literature. You want them to start become familiar with the poetry, the nonfiction, biography, all sorts of, mysteries. Just enjoy literature with them at that age and help them to understand that they don't always have to read the same exact kind of story, even if it's their favorite, that there's other stories and other genres out there that they might enjoy too. Okay, when we get to the later elementary, like 4th, 5th, and middle school, 6th, 7th, 8th, you're trying to improve fluency and vocabulary. You want them to be able to read something fluently, which means they don't stumble between words. They're able to kind of like use their eyeballs to read an entire chunk of words and then read it with expression, especially if there's, dialogue between characters. They can kind of, change their voice a little bit and get into it. You want to encourage that. And some kids are better at it than others. I think a lot of it has to do with the way you read stories to them when they're little, whether you're embarrassed about changing your voice for characters. But I think hearing a mom or a dad or a grandparent change their voice when they're doing characters encourages the child to do the same. And also, they start having to read for information in content areas. These grades are where we start giving them textbooks. Here's your social studies textbook. Well, social studies is not reading, but we're expecting them to read to get the information for social studies or read to get the information for science. Reading is fundamental to so many other subjects because that's how we expect them to get information. I will say I'm noticing a shift in going toward online YouTube documentaries. This seems to be a new way to try to present information to kids so they're not bored by textbooks. But in the generation I grew up in, reading was going to be fundamental to every other content area out there. And we were expected to learn to read well so that we could then do well in all the other subjects. Also, you want to start having some conversations about literary analysis. You don't need to excel at this or master this at this age level, but you want to start noticing what's the setting? Who are the characters in this story? What's the plot? And there are ways to introduce this to kids that are non-threatening and kind of fun. But again, you don't have to master it. You're going to just try to get them to start thinking about it and have conversations about those things. In the high school and college years is when you really move into the in-depth literary analysis. And there's also a whole list of literary terms that they're expected to know, like personification and alliteration and things like that. And there's books that you can, if you don't remember all these things, you can brush up on all of them yourself. And they're also even moving into literary critique. That is when they are expected to give informed judgments and opinions and take 2 or more literary works and compare and contrast them. So this is where it's a much more complex skill, but that's when they start to work on all of those things. They also are going to have an emphasis on a wide exposure to literature from different time periods, about different time periods, It's kind of fun to integrate history and literature at this point. I mean, it's actually fun to do it all through the grades, and I'll talk about that more when we get to our topic on history. But literature has been around for years. I mean, the Epic of Gilgamesh is back in Mesopotamian times, and starting to learn an appreciation for literature from other cultures and what was important to them. And like, you know, early English literature had like little half lines of words and kennings and things like that. So you start to have a wider focus on your literature studies so that they have a better idea of other cultures. Literature reflects the culture that that the author was living in. So they wrote about what they knew or what they imagined. And so you can get insight into other cultures by reading their literature. And that's even true today around the world. When you read literature from other cultures today, you can get a better sense for what the author is facing. Also, you can do author studies in high school and college years. So, you know, reading several books by Mark Twain. Shakespeare seems to be especially emphasized in the advanced years of literature. So learning more about how to read Shakespeare and act out his plays or go to one of his plays. There's other authors too, depending on your time frame that you're living in or that you're studying. You could pick, you know, anybody. Laura Ingalls Wilder, read all of her books. But just kind of getting more in depth to one author. So I'm going to come back to that at the very end. If you need to take a break to go do something, this is a good time to turn off the video, pause for a little bit, and then come back because I just want to go over quite a few resources that you can use for reading. All right. These next 3 pages are all typed up resources that I have used or have seen and can endorse. I'm not saying they will work for your family. I'm saying that I have seen them and their quality. But you're going to have to decide for yourself what your family needs and how you're going to move forward with these ideas. I'm actually going to skip Barton reading and come right back to it in just a minute. I want to talk about this one, Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. This is the book that I used with our kids. It looks like this, and you can tell that ours has been well loved. He starts there's 100. He starts lesson 1 with some phoneme and phonological awareness, like we were talking about earlier. But eventually, let's see what lesson this is. This is lesson 31. And you can see that they are having a dot here to remind the kids to start here and go this way. There's a dot under every sound that is voiced. You can see here that the T and H are joined together because it's one sound, the, E, the. And this tiny little E right here means you don't say it. So the word little, you don't hear the E at the very end. So he has the student read through the little tiny story, and he asks the parent to keep the picture covered so that the picture's not giving any clues at all to the child about what the story is. Once the child has made it through the story once, then the parent asks some questions about the story, looks at the pictures and talks about that, and then the child's supposed to go back and read it a second time, just to improve fluency. Now that they've sounded out every word, can they read it again a little bit faster? So by the 100th lesson, they are finally reading without the dots, they still have the arrows. Sorry, the book's falling apart. But they're all like the E, the silent E is still, it looks like a regular E now. I love this book. I love this method. This is a one book wonder, I think, because everything that you need to teach your child to read up to a 2nd grade level is in this book. It does take usually a year, sometimes a little bit longer. For extra motivation, I give my kids a hundreds chart when we start the book. And I let them put a sticker on every lesson as we finish it. And then for even more motivation and bribery, I always gave them a little prize when they got to a multiple of 10. and a major prize when they got to 100, because reading is a big deal, and learning to read consistently using this book and getting through it. You know, sometimes we would get to about lesson 20 or 30 and it would become hard. And I would realize that we probably started the book a little too soon. And we would put it away and we would do other things for a month or two. And then we'd get it back out and we'd try again. Maybe, you know, just going back a couple lessons. And usually they retained everything that they had, even if it had been a month or two since we started it. The other thing that you need to use with this program is just a basic handwriting sheet. Because as he introduces the letters, he asks the students to spend a couple minutes copying the letter into just using handwriting paper. So I really like this book. I used it with all of our kids. I put some Amazon links on there. If that's something that you would like to buy, those Amazon links will get me a small commission as an Amazon associate. But if you can find it used, that's great too, because it works most of the time. If you are having a student who has finished this book or has gotten halfway through this book and is crying every lesson, which yes, my kids would cry during some lessons. It's hard. It is possible that they are going to need something more intense. And that is why I put my favorite resource for struggling students at the top of the page. I became familiar with this resource about 5 years ago, and it is amazing. If you sense that you have a struggling reader, I would not hesitate to start with Barton right away. It is expensive. It is intense. You can do it at home. You don't have to hire a tutor. You can if you want to. It's 10 volumes. It can take 3 to 5 years to finish all 10 volumes, but it's worth it. If you have any hesitancy at all, reach out to me. Look up her stuff on her website. She is amazing. All right. I've already talked a little bit about Equip for Reading Success. Pathway Readers. There's a whole series, books like this, and then they have workbooks that go with them. It is written for the Amish community. So I always tell my kids that, because there are no pictures of humans anywhere. It is not good for teaching a lot of different cultures, because it is all set in Amish communities. If you would like to have readers that teach a wider cultural base, then probably this is not the series for you. I really like this. My kids have all used Pathway Readers. And they go up to grade 8 with workbooks. Christian Liberty Nature Readers. This is after they have mastered phonics. They're just little stories about nature, different creatures that you would find in nature. It's really good for like biology, but this is like Mr. Barnacle and Mr. Crab, and it actually is teaching factual information about each of those animals. So even if you might find a little bit of a story in it, it's actually still considered nonfiction. So Jellyfish is in this one. This is book 3. There are, I think, 6 books in this series. And you can use them as a main reader, or you can also just supplement your child's science education by using them. Next page, we have McGuffey Readers. I didn't pull those out. I do have them because we do a series every time, every few years we study pioneer history. And it's really fun to pull out the child's McGuffey reader at their level and see what they would have been doing in pioneer days with their reading books. Learning language arts through literature. I have the yellow book here. Each grade has a different color. This one says 3rd grade skills. So this would be what you would picture as a workbook with a lot of different skills going. This is actually the teacher's manual, but for the first day, and I'm not sure it's going to be set up to show you, but each day they have a little tiny bit of a poem, and then you actually do exercises based on that poem. So like spelling words from the poem, grammar, a little crossword puzzle to review. This is set up on a Monday through Friday rotation. So I use this with my daughter, And it does have links to 4 other books, but most of the time the excerpt for the week is taken from just a children's book that is good and wholesome. It teaches all language arts skills. The reason I put it here is because it uses literature. So we'll talk more about language arts in a few weeks. I did not take anything out of Veritas Press. I do have one of their, I used their package 1 year. Drawn into the Heart of Reading. These are just things that I thought would be worth looking into as far as curriculum. Honey for a Child's Heart is not curriculum. It is simply somebody who loves books and wanted to put together a book list for parents. It is older, so if you can find an updated version that includes books from the last 20 years, that might be more helpful. Mine was given to me at a baby shower when I first had my kids 20 years ago. So it just kind of gives you books that are worth investing in. And I have nowhere near all of these books. So it's just a great resource. Along those lines is one called The Company of the Creative. This one would be for more advanced learners. And it gives you more of an idea for high school and college levels. Definitely more reading, less lists, but still a really good compendium for if you're going to be teaching high school or college classes, which you might not be there yet. Then we have IEW has put out some information. This one is called Teaching the Classics. If you're not strong or feel confident in teaching the classic literature in the high school and advanced classes, this would be a good course for you to go through online. It even gives you like a worldview analysis worksheet and things like that. So that is simply just giving you a resource. All right. The last page is telling you other curriculum that incorporates literature into their overall plan. All of these have good books, and they weave them together in with science or with history or with Bible, so that you're doing more of a unit study instead of, this book in literature, this time period in history, this concept in science. These companies try to incorporate the other subjects, not all the other subjects, but a lot of the other subjects in with literature, so that you kind of get a double dose as you're studying. So that would be Sunlight, Bookshark, which is also put out by Sunlight, but is a secular curriculum. The Good and the Beautiful, sometimes abbreviated TGTB, and that is, you can look that up online. In fact, that one has a lot of PDF documents that you can download online for free. 5 in a Row is one of my favorite curriculum because it takes the same child's book and then comes up with different activities in each subject for the entire week based on that. That's why it's called 5 in a Row, is because you read the same book 5 days in a row, but you do something different with it every day. Beautiful Feet is a company that has put together lots of comprehension questions based on good literature. And My Father's World, which is similar to Sunlight, where they tell you which books to read which week as you go through and study things. I put down a link here from Better World Books. Better World Books is just a place where I get lots of used books at discounted prices. If you are trying to build a home library, or you're looking for resources and you don't mind buying secondhand, then I would highly recommend Better World Books. I've had good experiences with them, and the long link that is on there is a referral code where you and I will both get a coupon or a discount if you click on this link, but don't feel like you have to. Okay, that was a lot of information. I put reading as our very first academic topic to cover because I do believe reading is that important. After the Bible, I would say if you could only teach 2 subjects, it should be the Bible and reading. Of course, you're going to want to advance in other subjects as well. But once a child can learn to read on their own, their whole world opens up to them. And they have so many different places that they can explore. They can find out for themselves. They can read and read and read and read and read. And so then, I don't want to say your job is done, but you've introduced them to other experts who can feed into their knowledge and their interests. So teaching a child to read is very important. And if you're struggling with it, or your child is struggling with it, I'm sorry, you are not alone. There's a lot of great resources out there, and I would start with Barton and just kind of do some navigating yourself on the internet and just kind of see what other parents have been able to do. It's encouraging. It's very encouraging to see what a dedicated parent who wants to put the time in with their child can accomplish. And even when the child is feeling defeated or discouraged, a dedicated parent can still make a huge difference. So don't give up. Week 14, we're going to be using Wisdom's Way of Learning to talk about her ideas, Marilyn Hauschel. So if you haven't had a chance to download those yet, I think it's $3 for all 4 little ebooks, and we'll be talking about that on week 14. All right. Thanks for hanging out with me. Have a great week.